the Palo Alto Network's firewall interface concepts. We'll get in here to start discussing the interface types that we have available and how many different ways we can actually start to put these wonderful little firewalls into our network. I got support for layer 2, I got support for layer 3, I got support for all sorts of stuff. Basically, there's a whole lot of interface types that we can play with. Okay, so let's start talking about those a little bit. I mean, there's really 4 different modes. Well, I guess 5 if we count on the high availability, but 4 modes for our firewall interfaces. We're going to leave it at that. For traffic processing, there's going to be 4 different types that we're going to be able to play with. Okay. So when I start looking at it, we can start from an out of band, if you will, one that's called a tap mode. And that basically means that we've got to set up a switch, over here, and put a span port on it. So basically anything that's going to be passing through the switch will get copied over to the firewall at that point. Now, of course, it's pretty important to know that there's really not any change to the existing flow of packets or from the design of the network. However, we can't block any bad traffic, and we also can't decrypt any SSL sessions. So basically, it can't insert itself in the middle of any conversation there. So that's going to be one method of doing things. Another method that we have is, simple layer 2 mode. Okay, and at that point we're simply inserting ourselves in between devices, routers, switches, whatever it's going to be, but 2 layer 3 things in there. We can trunk interfaces into it, so I can do VLANs in here. I can do multiple VLANs, if you will. I can also do VLAN interfaces, so there is L3 support, even if I'm in layer 2 mode. So I have some differences or some things that I can be playing with in there. This kind of gives me the idea of what we call a virtual switch. So that's essentially where we're doing what a normal switch would in terms of programming VLAN information, in terms of putting my layer 3 information and stuff on there. It can't do VPNs. I have limited NAT that I have capability of doing, and I really can't do multicast, at least not multicast routing anyway, when I'm in layer 2 mode. Okay, so there are some, I guess, drawbacks to doing this, but this is more what we would consider an inline, or one method of inline deployment. The other method of inline deployment is vWire. Okay, which is a virtual wire, also known as transparent firewall. This is my true inline firewall. There's no layer 3 configuration whatsoever. There's no change to anybody's IP addresses. You can have my router out here and another router or switch or whatever's going to be going on in here. But basically this device will be completely inline. I have an inbound interface and I have an outbound interface. And that's the only way that things are going to be set up in there. Being that I'm not participating in the same way, again, I have some limitations in there. While I can use any combination of copper or fiber, so I could be fiber on the outside, copper on the inside, or vice versa, I can bind 2 and only 2 interfaces together, and there is no VPN support. There's a little bit of differences in there, but this is my true inline, or my true transparent firewall. And then I can also be in layer 3 mode, which is pretty much what it sounds like. That's layer 3, that's full IP participation, take the place of a current router or current layer 3 device, basically any layer 3 boundary that we're going to have. We have to put layer 3 information on there, but I can fully participate at that point. I have routing protocol support, I have multicast support, I have VPN support, I have pretty much everything. So that this is going to be a good way to get full services out of my firewall is to be in layer 3 mode. And that's also a common deployment. Really one of the two, the vWire or the layer 3 are my 2 most common deployment modes. Now, the cool thing is I can actually mix and match these interface types on a single chassis. When I'm in vWire, obviously there has to be a pair of interfaces. So my PA200 has 4 interfaces. So I could do a vWire, that would take 2 of them. and then I might take one interface and do some layer 2 stuff, and I can create sub-interfaces or VLANs or things like that, and maybe I can do another one and do tap. I guess it wouldn't make sense to do layer 3 with just one interface. So this might be a good deployment, and actually, now that I'm thinking about that, maybe that's what we'll do for our configuration setup, is we'll kind of work that into the lab over here. But we can mix and match and do all sorts of different things in here inside a single chassis, which really gives me a lot of control. Now, technically, HA is an interface type, okay, or a port type in there. But we do that in the high availability configuration, so that's really going to come at a later nugget. So I'll just kind of put that in quotes for right now. So we're not quite there yet, but a little bit later. Okay. So multicast support, like we said, we do have some in the vWire and definitely in my layer 3. This includes my policies. This includes participation in PIM sparse mode. It also includes participation in IGMP, so my client side version of multicast. So a lot of control that I have here as far as the types of interfaces and what kinds of things are going to be brought about. Now, one other thing to kind of add on here, get a different color, my PA, so greater than PA 500, will support lag. Lag. So my PA 500 will support 4 interfaces, my 2000 series will support 6 interfaces, anything larger than that will support 8 or possibly more interfaces into a single lag group. Okay, so we can do our Ether channel or aggregate Ethernet, depending on what vendor we happen to come from on there. But basically binding multiple Ethernet interfaces together for a single usable interface with higher speeds. So cool support that we have, the things that we can get going in there. Now, as we get moving through the rest of the stuff, I do want to kind of bring us into the idea of our interface zones and the profiles, the things that go along with it. Let's go ahead and kind of clear this off for you. Alright, so let's jump back into this here, so you get everything nice and cleared for you. So, zones and profiles. Now, first of all, my profile idea gives me an idea of permissions. Okay, so I can permit things as far as, services essentially, so like ping and telnet, SSH, HTTP, HTTPS for that matter, SNMP, they got things called response pages we'll get to later, and user ID stuff. But essentially it means that things on the interfaces going to the firewall. Okay, so destined for the firewall itself, whether you're going to allow them or not. And we can do it by IP, so we'll say service or IP filtering. So it gives us kind of controls, if you will, on how we're going to set it up. And they're called management profiles or interface management profiles. And you just go to an interface and you select which profile belongs to it. So, from my data center, really I might have pings just for reachability tests, but I really don't need anything else. My users, I might have that and my user ID stuff and some response pages and a few other things. My DMZ servers, I'd probably have SNMP, some controls that I may have going on in here. But, you can kind of mix and match and decide what works for your network. So you can set up profiles, and we'll do this in our configuration nugget as well to kind of help us with what's going on there. But that gives you an idea of the thought process in there. Now, zones on the other hand, okay, so other than our interfaces themselves, you have zones. And zones, honestly, are just like other vendors. So there's not a concept in here. It's a way of managing trust. Okay, so our trust levels. Who do we trust? Who do we not trust? Like looking at this, so I may have a DMZ zone. I may have one user zone that encompasses all of that, have a data center zone, have an INET zone for out here. I could split things up and even have like an exec zone, a guest zone, an HR users or whatever I have, whatever I need to do in there. So it's all based on the trust levels as well as the boundaries, the security boundaries that you want to set up. So once we have these are just lines, magical lines that we draw in here. And once we have this is what leads us to security policy. So the policy is going to say what actually happens based on going from one zone to another one. Okay, so decide what it is that we have going on. Default policies, by the way, let's see, intrazone is good, interzone is bad. So basically you permit things that going between interfaces in the same zone, so like users to user right here would be perfectly fine, but if I didn't have anything else set up, the users could not go to the internet, could not go to the DMZ, could not go to the data center. So it just depends on what it is that we want to do. Now, zones there are actually configured by, what type of interface, if you will. So when I start looking at these things, it's the type of interface happens to be different. Okay, so like looking at a name, a name is just something that we assign. So DMZ is an example. So I may have a DMZ L3 interface or zone, and this tells me, so the DMZ part is what I've configured. The L3 tells me that it was assigned to a layer 3 interface at that point in time. It cannot be in the same zone as looking at like a vWire 1 or a TAP 1 or a layer 2 interface for that matter. So I can't have the zones like that mix and match. So I do have to be careful when I'm thinking about what my zones are compared with my interface types and what I'm going to have going on. So that's going to be kind of I guess something to consider as we move along in here. But like I said, all it is just a management of the trust levels. We'll start to see them in action, especially when we get into our basic configuration, and certainly when we get into our security policy for things. Other pieces real quick, since we're on like the interface types, I kind of forgot to mention them before. We do have loopbacks that we can use. Now loopbacks, just like on any other vendor's router, are always going to be on, so they're always there. Use them for router IDs and stuff like that. We can use them in our routing type setup, obviously when we're participating at layer 3 and have routing protocols running. So that's more where they're going to be important for stuff, or for other methods of management would be another mechanism also. I can do tunnel interfaces. So this is going to be used with either IPsec or SSL VPN. I'll put the little or there. So get those in case we happen to set anything up where we're going to have either users or a particular extra client out here, another network out here that I need to create a tunnel for. So I can create those interfaces as well. And last but not least, but probably our more common one, is going to be subinterface. Subinterfaces are very common with VLANs and layer 3 trunking. So that's going to kind of conclude the different types. I'll go ahead and block this off a little bit over here. The different types of interfaces that we have, as well as our introduction anyway to the zones or trust levels that I want to start thinking about, and kind of get you thinking about how we're going to apply this into our network. Because of course, that's the next thing we're going to do. Now that we talk about this stuff, let's sit down and work out a plan and actually make it happen. Alright, so this was kind of a good basic and well, we'll call it slow and easy way of getting into things, where we talked about my interface types. And really, whether I'm going to be on a physical box or on a virtual box, the concept is going to be the same in how we're doing things. So I had my L2 mode, I had my tap mode, I had vWire, my virtual wire anyway, or my transparent method, E, or I had my layer 3. Now keep in mind that if I was doing things on a on my VM, on my ESXi host or anything, I would have to have other interfaces set up first. So my VM interfaces would need to be configured, my VM switch fabric, my VM deployment groups, whatever they're going to be named in there, I would have to have that configured before I actually get to configure them on the firewall itself. So there's a little bit of difference, a little bit of, I guess, planning that goes on when we're starting to think of things in the VM operation. Remember that we also had a limitation we talked about in previous nuggets of 10 interfaces per VM, and that was actually a VMware limitation. And honestly, it's probably the same for Citrix and Linux, because I haven't heard anything different about that, but I haven't used those, so I don't know that 100%, so we'll kind of run with that for right now. But anyway, so those are my interface types. We also talked about the profiles, or our interface management profiles, where I was able to go in and decide what kind of traffic was allowed to the firewall from that particular interface. So again, the pings, the telnet, the SSH, the web stuff, the user ID stuff, things along those lines. But this was a management profile that we could set up and then tag to any particular interface in there. And last but not least, of course, and certainly going to be one of our important starts to getting into our security policy, was setting up zones. And that is simply a trust level. So where it is that we're going to draw those boundaries, how we're going to separate things out, and where we want to have controls between one area and the next. And that pretty much covers my interface concepts. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.